Welcome back, everybody. Our last urban legend was a lot to go over. Trust me, it was a lot to write. And I thought we'd choose a shorter topic as a bit of a breather. Oh, don't misunderstand me. That doesn't mean today's episode will be boring. This topic is one that people may have heard about peripherally, or as a quick warning instead of a story. And these urban legends have mostly died out, though some have evolved. So how do we feel about shopping malls? Stories about abductions or mutilations happening in America's malls grew in tandem with the popularity of malls. But times have changed, a lot. In fact, some of our younger listeners might not really understand what the big deal was, as they've grown up during the death knell of mall culture, where it's used more often as a backdrop for shows like Stranger Things rather than a place that's visited in real life. In a country without next-day delivery or easy access to mom-and-pop shops, malls were incredibly convenient when it came to consumption needs. Instead of driving to 4 or 5 different locations, now you had a one-stop shop. Social events were held in malls, providing a place of culture and a chance to socialize. Malls used to include third places, something that's quite rare these days. The phrase third places refers to locations where you don't have to spend money. It isn't your workplace, and it has a social element. Unfortunately, most of our casual third places have been eliminated by corporate greed. But once upon a time, they did exist. But urban legends are built on challenging the concept of safety and responsibility. Let's analyze that challenge in one of the busiest places of our childhoods. So let's go back a few decades, back to when malls were the place to be. A story in the American press reported a mother shopping with her 4 kids for summer clothes at the Woodbury Commons in New York. They'd been at it for a while, and her 4-year-old son starts complaining that he was tired, asking to go sit on a nearby bench. She glances at the bench, and since it's within her eyesight, she says he can. Scanning across the throngs of people, the mom notices a man walking towards the bench, pushing an empty baby carriage. Assuming his child is with the mother, she turns back to her own kids. But the next time she looks up, the man and her child are gone. Desperately asking people nearby if they'd seen her son, they said a man had put a protesting child into the stroller and walked quickly for the door. Everyone figured that it was his child, who was just fussing about being put in the carriage. The local police arrive, grimly telling the mother that this isn't the first time they'd been called for a similar incident. In fact, these occurrences were becoming so frequent that they feared this was a growing method to kidnap children. The kid would be stuffed into a stroller, partially covered with a coat or bag, and hustled to the nearest exit. This particular story has no happy ending, only a desperate plea to spread word of this story to anyone with children. Jean Luther of Springfield, Illinois writes, quote, "This new trick seems to be passed along amongst pedophiles everywhere because of its success. Very few children have ever been recovered, making the tale even more tragic. Make sure you let everyone know about this so we can stop these sickos from having any more success at this. Mall security forces everywhere have been alerted to this, but if you see a man hanging around with a carriage with no kids, or see a man trying to get a screaming kid into his carriage and/or leave the store, call security to stop them. It's better to call on an innocent man than to let the guilty get away." This was a common conclusion reached by many. However, the perpetrator quickly expanded to become a pedophile, a homosexual, or a member of a satanic cult. Some swore that there was an entire pedophile ring involved, though no hard facts ever emerged to corroborate this. But that did nothing to smother the story, as it was even featured on the religious program The 700 Club. But again, no evidence was ever discovered. So, we have our first method of spiriting away a child, but we're just getting started. Soon, these monsters would come up with far more creative methods. In 1993, an urban legend article in the popular women's magazine McCall's featured this story. A young mother and her 4-year-old daughter are shopping, but while the mother is trying on clothes, her little girl disappears. She sounds the alarm, and the security team scours the mall. They're about to give up when one of the guards decides to search the men's bathroom. He finds the terrified little girl, standing on the toilet so that her feet aren't visible under the door. But this girl looks different from the one he'd been told was missing. This little girl's hair had been chopped off, and what was left had been dyed blonde. She's also dressed in boys' clothes. The girl had clearly been kidnapped by a, quote, child-snatching ring, and they'd hurriedly changed her appearance just enough to slip out of the mall unnoticed. But the hornet's nest had been kicked, and with the security members bustling around, the kidnapper must have realized the jig was up. They abandoned the girl in the bathroom to escape. A similar version of this story took place at a very familiar theme park. This makes sense for the evolution of these child abduction stories, since the crowds of jostling families can make it even more difficult for bystanders to be able to determine what child belongs to which parents. A mother and son, the child being 4 to 6 years old, sits on the curb of Main Street, Disney. Mom looks around for just a moment, and her son is gone. Wasting no time, she alerts security. As they start the search, they bring the mother into a security room to have her scan the streets for her son. They specifically coach her to only look at faces, not clothes or hair. But she didn't have to worry for long. The story goes that the time between her stepping into that security room to the moment her son was found was 3 minutes. Apparently, quote, a couple of Iranians were hustling him, now in different clothes and with a buzzed haircut, out of one of the entrances. The story claims that the kidnappers had obviously taken the kid for the purposes of selling him. The 1994 source that published this story also remarks that, quote, no such incidents have been reported to Orlando or Anaheim police. But then we take a wild turn. Quote, this means either that no such abductions have taken place there, or that a massive conspiracy cover-up campaign exists involving parents, media, the Walt Disney Corporation, and the local police departments. Well, that would definitely be one hell of a cover-up. The child disguise story reached its height in popularity between 1995 to 1999. In 1996, there were 220 references to kidnappings in shopping malls. This number climbed to 361 by the next year. By 98, this number had jumped to a whopping 580. These stories seem to hone in specifically on Disney parks, as they were mentioned in 287 stories in 1996. This leapt up to 591 by 1996, and to 690 in 1998. The motives of the kidnapper are understood to be far from harmless, but it also leaves an opportunity open for the narrator to claim that they know why the children were taken. One suggested motive was to use the child victim in kiddie porn. Another was that the abductor would sell the kid to black market adoption. But even if you don't believe the specific reason given by the narrator, the concept of kidnapping isn't necessarily a far-fetched one. This constant fear that every parent has keeps the story alive. Jean-Harold Brunvan writes in his book, The Choking Doberman, that this story seems to be a possible offshoot of a less popular story, where a woman is robbed in the dressing room of a department store. But the thief didn't exactly ask nicely. No, he simply chopped her finger off entirely to take her diamond ring or gold wedding band, bones and all. Sometimes the story ends with her tragically bleeding to death in the dressing room, or in transit to the hospital. We'll talk more about these child abduction stories later. For now, we'll finish covering the story types with a different bloody threat. On the eastern end of Long Island, a mother shops at, quote, a big department store, like Gimbel's, with her 5 or 6-year-old son. The son needs to go to the bathroom, so the mother turns towards the ladies' room. He digs in his heels, whining that he's old enough to go to the men's room on his own now, Mom. She relents, telling him to hurry. She takes up a post outside the door and waits. He goes in, but he doesn't come out. Nervous, the mother asks a middle-aged man heading into the bathroom to check on her son. The man agrees to her request, but starts screaming as soon as he walks inside. The mother dashes in to find her son bleeding to death on the floor. Someone had cut off his penis. The final line of the story pulls back its focus to the narrator, describing how she could hardly finish the story, gasping through tears. We still have more to go over, but I raised an eyebrow at this. The mother was standing literally at the door to the bathroom. Whoever did this to her son would have no way of leaving without being noticed, let alone covered in blood. Quite a strange crime to commit in broad daylight with no escape route. Another version of the story seems to fix this enormous oversight. This adaptation takes place at the Redbird Mall in Dallas, Texas, now called the Southwest Center Mall. The story is pretty close to the last one, except that the son is 8 years old. And this time, a group of boisterous teens go into the bathroom after the son enters. The group comes back out, laughing and pushing each other. But again, there's no blood on the perpetrators. In either of these versions, I'm also not sure how the boys managed to cut off a body part in total silence. The boy either doesn't scream, or they manage to muffle it completely, even as the mother is on the other side of the wall. Brunvand himself was sent the earlier child mutilation story from Wharton, New Jersey, scrawled on a floral-patterned piece of stationery. The victim is always young and innocent, the act of violence done in an attempt to eliminate their sexuality. Quote, thus the minority tries to assault uncorrupted representatives of our culture at the very point where the culture's future lies. So let's talk about what these child abduction and mutilation stories tell us. The creation of malls was called the, quote, death of small-town America. Instead of ping-ponging from mom-and-pop store to mom-and-pop store, now all of your needs were in the same building. While this was incredibly convenient, a lot of people saw this as America turning their back on the folksy community culture of Main Street. Brunvand points out that, like any other place where large groups of people gather, malls started to become a kind of cultural crossroads. Black, white, rich, poor, elderly, the young, quote, everyone's money is green in a mall. But not everyone in the world is trustworthy, and soon people were concerned about who they were sharing elbow room with. Predictably, this would allow cultural and racial biases to float to the surface. For example, the Iranians trying to kidnap the kid from Disney. The connection between malls and theme parks, like Disney, is argued by Pamela Donovan in her 2004 book, No Way of Knowing, to be a mix of fear of consumerism combined with xenophobia. You see, anyone can pay to get in, so there's no racially or culturally based social segregation anymore, broadly speaking. Who are you standing next to in line? If you're at Disney, they might not even be from the same state, let alone the same country. And there was a fear prevalent at the time that society hadn't updated itself to keep up with this new merged public, and that we lacked the resources to respond to serious crimes in a timely manner. There's an irony that even though all of these people gathered under one roof, arguably as one people, there was still a sense of, quote, solidarity being lost. The paranoia of the criminal element was at the front of people's minds, shattering the dream of a unified humanity. It started to make people realize something that we discussed a few episodes ago. We don't know our neighbors. According to the idealism of old Americana, the days of Main Street, picket fences, and mom-and-pop shops, you knew all of your neighbors. If someone came to town, their presence would shoot to the top of the gossip chain. Everyone kept an eye on who was going to church on Sundays, and noted whoever was missing. When you walked into that mom-and-pop store, you knew mom and pop. But the efficiency and production number of cars increased. Now, cars could drive further than before. Highways were constructed, spanning the country, making shortcuts and eliminating the use of smaller roads. With the ability to drive greater distances to reach a single building with anything the average American could possibly need, why would they shop at mom and pops in a small town that seemed to grow smaller and smaller on the map? People could just make a day trip to the mall, but now a lot of people could do the same. Too many people for you to know intimately. So let's split the hairs about this unknown public. Hijacking short stories in order to express racism is nothing new. Brunvand writes, quote, "Centuries ago in Europe, it was the gypsies who were said to be stealing babies. At Christmas time in 1999 in northern Indiana and southwest Michigan, it was, guess who? The gypsies again, this time rumored to be stealing babies from Meijer stores." Several versions of the abducted child explicitly implicate Jewish shop owners. It took media, government, and civic organizations' interference and research to debunk this claim, exposing it as an attempt to spread anti-Semitism. Bar Tolkien writes about the major folklore theme of, quote, the international minority conspiracy, what he paraphrased as, quote, cultural paranoia. The broad strokes are that you always need to keep an eye on those from outside your own immediate race, as it's not if they attack us, it's when. Quote, and they'll also strike without warning in the settings of our simplest pleasures, amusement parks and movie theaters, or in our safe, middle-class centers of commerce, department stores and shopping centers. And the anti-Semitic train of this urban legend is sadly so much older than I anticipated. The anti-Semitism related to this urban legend can be traced back to the 5th century AD, when historian Socrates, not the philosopher, claimed that in Mestar, Syria, quote, a group of Jews tortured and murdered a Christian child in mockery of Christ. However, the violence on the other side of that coin goes even further back, to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Roman lawyers Tertullian and Minucius Felix claimed that Christian initiation rites required the ceremonial murder of a Jewish child. It seems that the anti-Christian rhetoric was taken and adapted into subsequent anti-Semitic stories, which then survived far longer. Some other famous versions came from medieval England, even naming specific boys. William of Norwich was killed in 1144, Hugh of Lincoln in 1255. Both were rumored to have been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by Jews as part of their Passover celebration, their bodies thrown into a cesspool or well. I hope I don't have to tell you that this isn't how the Passover service works at all. The evidence? One of the boys' mothers was given divine intervention, the truth being revealed to her by, quote, miraculous means, and any Jew she pointed to was punished severely. The Canterbury Tales were composed from about 1387 until Geoffrey Chaucer's death in 1400. In it was The Prioress's Tale, where a Christian schoolboy offends a group of Jews because he sung a Christian hymn too loudly. The Jews are so angry at this kid that they don't even act in the moment. No, they hire an assassin to murder him. The story claims that they hated this singing child so much that they saved up and spent money on having him killed and thrown in a privy. But the boy's singing was just so damn holy that it wouldn't stop, continuing to echo from the privy where the body lay. This allows his mother to discover his body so that he can have a Christian burial. Though I admit I'm a little surprised that none of the Jewish murderers met a terrible fate. The British ballad of Sir Hugh, written by Matthew Paris in the 14th century, migrated to the United States, where it bounced around as oral tradition. The song tells a story where some boys were playing ball in Lincoln. They accidentally toss it over the wall of a Jewish home, or through the house's window. A boy is sent to retrieve the ball. The Jewish daughter of the house lures him inside, tempting him with an apple. Once hidden from view, she stabs him in the heart. In some versions, she catches the boy's blood in a basin and puts a prayer book at his head and a Bible at his feet. She rolls him into a lead case. Quote, "She's thrown him in Our Lady's draw well, was 50 fathom deep." Irritated that she can't find her son, the murdered boy's mother prowls the streets, carrying a rod with which to beat him. The boy's spirit, much like the murdered Christian choir boy, calls to his mother from inside the well, telling her to prepare for a funeral. Even the Grimm brothers got in on this horrific action. They made an 1816 to 1818 compilation of German oral tradition, including a story called The Rock of the Jews. Already, it doesn't sound promising. In the year 1462, in the village of Rinn in Tyrol, a group of Jews convince a farmer to sell his son. They walk the child into the forest until they reach a large boulder, where they slaughter him. Battered and stabbed, his body was hung from a birch tree near a bridge. This action earned the boulder the title, The Rock of the Jews. The belief that Jews required an innocent Christian's blood for their Passover and other ritual purposes ran rampant throughout the Middle Ages. Occasionally, the belief elaborated that the Jews needed the Christian blood to mix into their Passover bread. This belief came from the Romans misunderstanding the Christian Eucharist. And when you say that you're consuming the body and blood of Christ, I kind of get how the Romans believed that Christians were cannibals. Completely incorrect, but that's what happens when you only look skin deep with any religion or culture. This cannibalism belief was then flipped and put onto the Jews, hence the blood and Passover bread. This unfortunate belief was so outrageous that it managed to cling on through oral and written history. Centuries later, it was wielded by Adolf Hitler as more proof of the necessity for the final solution. So yeah, I've heard a lot of people dismiss this kind of deep dive into ghost stories and urban legends. However, if you look at history, you have to acknowledge that these things can have very real consequences. Something in common between these anti-Semitic stories, from what I can tell, is that no real reason is given for why the Jews are so angry or bloodthirsty. Sure, we could go back to the conflicts of history, the fighting over the Holy Land, the butting heads of the Abrahamic religions, but these stories don't reference this history. The story or song simply tells its story with the collective understanding that we all know that this is just how they are. This fed anti-Semitic hatred for literal centuries, many of it being based on fictional stories like these, told not with the intent to entertain, but with the specific purpose to spread hatred and fear. In the last 50-plus years, the race, religion, or sexual standing of the victims and the aggressors shuffles like a deck of cards. Sometimes the victim is white and blonde. Sometimes the aggressors are Black, Indian, or Mexican. Sometimes the victim is Black, the mutilator's white. Sometimes the attackers are homosexual, or, from earlier decades, a hippie. The story will occasionally throw in the extra tidbit that the mutilation is being done as a ritual or gang initiation, like this story from 1965. The story goes as we've already heard, but when the mother asks a man to go in and investigate, he finds the boy in a pool of blood. Quote, subsequently, they found 3 little black boys walking through the store with a bloody penis in their pocket. As it turned out, they had cut the little white boy's penis off as an orientation, a method of getting into a gang that they wanted to belong to. And to get into the gang, they had to cut the penis off a white boy, which they did do. While incredibly gruesome, one of the most chilling details is the descriptor, quote, 3 little black boys, creating an implication that these were young children doing such an awful act to a kid who otherwise would have been a peer. But in another version from Brazil, Indiana in 1970, the victim is black, as are the 3 attackers, which further pushes the main message: no one is safe. Quote, a woman in Dallas used her engraved personal letterhead stationery to report hearing the story told first in Boston and later in Texas. In the latter instance, she said the legend was used, quote, as an example of rampant, deviant homosexual behavior. And in both of her versions, the storytellers claimed that the crime had not been reported in the newspapers because it was overly bloody. Sometimes people say the police or the store involved are suppressing the story in order to avoid hurting business. Whichever identifiers are chosen, race, religion, or otherwise, when they're cherry-picked for the story, it's adjusted for the audience and the location of the telling. It's to prove a point, or to identify those outside of the community norm. Back to the present day and the fear of the public when in a public space. Again, the culture of the past 50 years or so clearly shows that we no longer feel there's safety in numbers. Instead, it means potential danger being hidden by those numbers. Even if we turn from the kidnapper to the rest of the bystanders, how many people watched the man stuff this screaming child into the stroller and leave? No parents, lawyers, off-duty cops, or any other of the responsible public stepped in. The bystanders are exempt from blame, since the crime is so clever, while also being criticized for their lack of awareness. Even if these unknowing witnesses were unaware exactly what it was they were seeing, the point is still the same. We aren't safe with the public. This paranoia of the public comes hand in hand with a very American ideal, the emphasis on self-reliance. There's no one else that you, as a parent, can look to, just your own wits and judgment. A variety of tools have popped up to assist this pressure of independence, such as child leashes, photos on milk cartons, and even preemptively fingerprinting children. Quote, the way to protect against the alleged crime is wholly an individual matter. Debunkers also express individualist responsibility for self-protection, emphasizing the importance of watching out for yourself and your loved ones and using common sense, implying that victims of the crime were really victims of poor parental judgment. Donovan writes, quote, several of these fears are expressed in this one legend alone. Fear of crime and mistrust of strangers. You don't know everyone here. Criminals could be anywhere in the crowds you encounter every day, blending in with the masses. Lack of faith in the willingness and effectiveness of police protection. The police are powerless to recover the missing children and therefore don't even try. And distrust of powerful, monolithic corporations. Disney doesn't care about you or your children. They'll pay you off to make sure you don't ruin their carefully cultivated image. This suggests a bigger conspiracy by the public, that large corporations, including the police, care more about their public image than they do about children and the safety of the public. All of this walks us down the path to a term that we've heard quite a few times already: moral panic. Frequently discussed around topics like the satanic panic, moral panic is the more general fear that something is actively threatening the values and well-being of the community. America under threat, so to speak. In the 1980s, the United States saw a feverish rise in anxieties over children's safety, or threatened children. This was further inflated by the missing child panic of the 80s. Parent groups wrung their hands at the idea of parents taking their children on shopping trips. This prompted Walmart to create the Code Adam program. The description of a missing child would be sent out to the employees, all of which were required to stop their current task immediately to look for the kid. A few employees would stand at the exits to be sure no one left with the child, which certainly overlaps with the kidnapping urban legends. Adults started to see danger everywhere: preschools, shopping malls, and at neighbors' houses on Halloween night. This culminated in waves of reports and outrageous claims about these places, with little to no evidence or results. As psychology started to become more known to the public in general towards the end of the 80s, a switch began to take place, and the story evolved. With a more widespread knowledge of psychopathology specifically, the focus was slowly taken off of mass conspiracies, kidnapping rings, and traffickers. The attention shifted instead to the single crazy lunatic who blended into the crowd, which isn't really accurate either. However, it's worth mentioning that while urban legends about criminal activity contributed to moral panics, an urban legend isn't a moral panic in and of itself. Urban legends don't push communities to demand social reform or more protective measures to be taken by law enforcement. For such a terrible story, and though it was widespread, the result of people sharing the fable seemed to be nothing more than an anticlimactic warning to watch out. However, that last message does bring us to another purpose for the story: to scare the shit out of parents. The parents in these urban legends are at fault for losing track of their own child, but the overarching evil is consumerism. In quite a few versions, the parent, usually the mother, has been distracted by some shiny new window display, or, like in one of the stories we mentioned, by trying on clothes to purchase for themselves. How could a parent seek out their own interests? They let their attention waver due to selfish desires, and this is their punishment. A connection can be made to the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which could be its own short episode altogether. The basic story goes that in 1284, a German town is plagued by rats. A Pied Piper mysteriously appears and says that he can get rid of the rats, for a price. The village eagerly agrees, but when the piper plays his magical flute and lures the rats away, the village refuses to pay up. Later that year, the piper returns. He plays his enchanted flute again, but this time, he draws the children away. Depending on the version, sometimes a child is left behind. They're either handicapped, so they couldn't keep up, or deaf, so the music didn't affect them. But no matter what, those children are gone forever. All because the adults prioritized money and material goods over morals, and therefore their children. Donovan writes, quote, "Does the same fear animate the modern abduction legends? Do the shopping mall and Disney theme parks represent the soft life, or rampant debt-fueled consumerism? It is often noted by raconteurs of the modern legend that one need only turn one's head a moment or two, perhaps with eyes lured by some glittering object, for one's child to disappear." The location themselves are also interesting. Why are the kids never abducted from a school, their home, or even around a workplace? They're always snatched from a place of entertainment or leisure. Well, that's because being at home, school, or near a workplace are all morally safe. If you're at home with your kids, you're at the ideal location for comfort, control, and influence on the child's life. If the child's at school, it's where they're diligently working on their education and future, certainly an acceptable place to be. Near a workplace, the parents are working like responsible, contributing members of society, ready to go home and rejoin the family after a productive day of work. All inarguably socially acceptable ways to spend your time. But the mall or a theme park? The discussion starts to slip into an air of laziness or frivolity. After World War II, after years of war gardens, bonds, and contribution to the war effort, the societal expectation was that your purchases should be practical, only being just what you needed. But a time of peace after war has its own changes. Though the war was certainly chaotic, it was also very unifying. Everyone seemed to be on the same page when it came to what everyone needed to contribute, or how they could help. Everyone was allied against a common enemy, and were willing to work together towards bringing their loved ones home. But once the war was over, the feverish pace America had been working at suddenly slowed. Factories weren't racing to keep up with the demand for artillery shells or tanks. There wasn't a world conflict to point to as an excuse to pressure the public to donate their money. There was the post-war plenty, where consumer goods were widely available, and the economy soared. Without the need to be at the factory or overseas, leisure time was on the rise, but people were getting concerned about how others were spending their time. There was also a lack of agreement of what people's roles were. Women had done a great job at holding down the fort and providing labor for the war effort, but the men were home now. It was time to go back to what they were meant to do. This chafed against the women's new standards. The female population had the opportunity to be self-sufficient in the men's absence, and that freedom was worth fighting like hell to stay out of their gilded cages. While this tug-of-war was going on in the workforce, it extended to judging what women were doing in other areas of their lives. Why are you spending so much time looking at colorful new dresses when you could be at home making dinner? Why bring your child to socialize and practice being out in the world when you could be sitting them down to do homework? Why did you let your kid go into the public restroom alone? The public's in there. Though it's been decades since, the stories are still trying to influence the listener towards what's viewed as a responsible way to spend one's time, and to sway the behavior of the parents, particularly mothers. If nothing else, these legends certainly serve as warnings about poor caregiving. It reminds us that childcare is a full-time job you can't turn away for a second. Have you checked and double-checked the babysitter who takes your kids on outings? Have you thoroughly scoured the environments you bring your kids to? Have you taught them how to resist a potential kidnapper? And at the end of the day, who cares if these stories aren't 100% accurate? They're still influencing parents to take better care of their kids, right? But the truth is, children are in far more danger from people they know rather than from strangers. As Grigo and Kilzer write, quote, "The likelihood of one's child being abducted by a stranger is less than the chance that she or he will choke to death on food." Even when children are kidnapped, there's little to no evidence that they were kidnapped specifically as part of a pedophile ring, satanic cult, or prostitution syndicate. These stories are told for reasons other than the truth, one of which being to influence and manipulate the public politically. In April of 1965, The Realist published the article Anatomy of a Rumor by Oliver Platt. A story circulating during election season was that in October 1964, at the New York World's Fair, a 9-year-old boy was castrated by, quote, presumably, 2 black youths seen leaving the restroom the boy was found in. This was complete fiction. Quote, "It was, in fact, propaganda skillfully devised and artfully disseminated." Palat had doggedly traced the story back through journalists, to the police, to the World's Fair officials, to witnesses, and the only detail that was corroborated was that the World's Fair was indeed occurring in 1964. Quote, "Everything else was purely fictional hearsay, despite the fact that, as a Manhattan bus driver told him, everybody knows about it, even the dogs in the street are barking about it." People are always eager for someone to blame. The idea that we have foresight gives people comfort, even if that supposed foresight is based on a boiling hatred with no legitimate foundation. But when it comes to child abduction or mutilation stories, there's always an easy defense. The ability to raise your hands and say, okay, so I didn't verify the source of the story. But can you blame me? I'm concerned for the kids. This ironically uses the kids as a justification and shield against the consequences of their own hatred. So that wraps up the first half of the episode. The second half is still about mall abductions, but we're shifting the identity of our victims, from children to women. Our first collection of short stories comes from an email, passed around as a public service announcement about how women were being abducted from malls. The first scam involves a man approaching a woman at a mall and asking if she likes pizza. He offers her $100 to do a photo shoot for a commercial. Sound good? Great. We just need to go outside where the lighting's better. Cue kidnapping. The next ploy is that a nicely dressed man asks a woman if she wouldn't mind being in a PSA about drug use. The man will explain that they don't want professional actors or celebrities. They want real people, specifically, quote, the average mother. Once she goes out with him, she's gone forever. The third trick, the one that the email claims is the most successful, involves a frantic man sprinting up to a woman, desperately telling her that his baby's not breathing. Same conclusion. The email insists that these kidnappings are happening en masse in well-lit parking areas, day or night, all over the country. Quote, Inside Edition set up a test in a mall, and 10 out of 15 women went out of the mall on the pizza and the PSA scam. 100% of women went out of the mall on the emergency baby scam. Please pass this along to your friends and family, as now that it has been shown on nationwide TV, there are bound to be copycats of this. When following up on this last quote, it turns out that Inside Edition did indeed run a story about mall kidnappings in August 1998, but that they failed to report a single specific incident of kidnapping using the 3 tricks they warned about. The Miami Herald published an article on September 26, 1980, with the headline, Truth is the Victim in Wild Kidnap Tale, with the subheading, White Slavery Rumors Spread in 2 Counties. The article traces the steps of Ron Kaminsky, a manager of The Falls, a shopping mall in Florida. Ron introduced himself to someone at a Fort Lauderdale bar, this person responding, quote, Oh, you manage The Falls. That's where they're abducting all those girls. Apparently, girls were being dragged out of public restrooms and sent off to South America as slaves. Despite this sounding like a wild rumor more than a true story, Kaminsky questioned 58 store managers and 5 restaurant managers. He even warned the guards of the mall, but he found nothing to support the stories. He did manage to track down the basic story, though. A mother and daughter are eating lunch at a shopping mall. The daughter goes to the restroom and doesn't come back. The mother follows, managing to catch 2 women dragging her unconscious daughter away. Quote, The women flee, and the daughter is saved from life as a slave in South America. In some tellings, the abductors are women. In others, they're men. And other times, they're men dressed as women. The victims are usually, quote, beautiful blonde teenage girls. Despite many papers reporting this story openly admitting that they had yet to find a first-hand or even second-hand account, the story continued to spread. On November 10, 1980, the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin published an article titled, Abduction Rumors Have Police Puzzled. The article repeated the same narrative we just heard about, except the drug was identified as a, quote, shot full of heroin, and it took place in West Town Shopping Center. Quote, the article revealed that numerous calls to the police about the alleged incident cited only third- and fourth-hand information and had produced nothing solid to act on. The Times article concluded by mentioning a familiar story that was floating around 10 years earlier. one about a gang of hippies assaulting and mutilating young boys in discount stores. In a follow-up story 3 days later, the Capital Times added that sometimes the girls were injected with cocaine or LSD, and occasionally the home base of this kidnapping ring was Chicago. In Midwestern states, the Sin City was often reported to be Chicago, Detroit, or St. Louis. According to Brunvaughn's book, The Choking Doberman, the abductors try to explain that they're dragging a person away because they're a sick relative or friend. But the kidnappee is almost always recognized and rescued, though sometimes their hair has been cut short and darkened with shoe polish, similar to the child kidnapping stories. An extra detail is that the kidnappers sit behind their target in a theater, injecting them through a crack in the folding seat. Let's look at another method. A woman walks out of the Tuttle Mall in Columbus, Ohio, heading to her car. But damn, she's got a flat. She has a tire jack and spare in the trunk, and a helpful man in a business suit comes over to offer assistance. Replacing the tire takes a minute, so once it's on, he asks if she can drop him at the other side of the mall where his car is. She's uncomfortable with his request, but he keeps pushing. She finally asks why he was in this parking lot if his car was on the other side of the mall. Oh, I was just talking to some friends, but they headed out. But something still feels off. Oh, I can't believe it. I'm sorry, I forgot to pick up a dress I ordered in the mall. I'll be right back. She heads straight to the mall's security office, and a guard agrees to escort her to her car. When they get to her car, the man's already gone. She feels a little silly, until they pop the car's trunk. They find the man's briefcase. He'd set it inside while they changed the tire. There weren't exactly bills and reports inside. Instead, they found a rope and a butcher knife. If that wasn't chilling enough, when she takes the car to a mechanic later, he tells her that nothing was wrong with her tires at all. Someone had just let the air out of it. Now we're going to take a fairly large step out of the US. Our first stop is in Thailand. A Doshisha University student traveled around Thailand and ends up at a, quote, first-class department store in a mall. She walks into the dressing room and undresses. The floor drops, taking her down to the basement. In that basement is a group of men, waiting for their victim. They sell her into prostitution. Quote, she is said to be still alive and living in Shiga Prefecture. This next story is intriguing, as it was collected from a folklore term paper written by Sachiko Shudo, a Japanese-born student. However, the story takes place in Paris, implying that the fear of traveling to foreign countries isn't unique to Americans. A Japanese newlywed couple flies to Paris for their honeymoon. The husband waits outside of a trendy boutique's dressing room as she goes inside to try on dresses. Time passes. Too much time. He asks a female employee to check on her, but there's no one in the dressing room. Bizarrely, the husband thinks this is an elaborate practical joke, apparently, so he goes back to the hotel, but she's not there either. Still thinking it's a joke, he waits for hours. In the morning, he finally calls the police, the boutique, and Paris hospitals in a panic. Nothing. After 3 weeks of searching, not a single clue is found. Eventually, the husband has to return to Japan. 5 years pass, quite unusual for an urban legend, and the husband gets a call from a friend who traveled to the Philippines. The friend saw his wife in Manila, quote, as the featured attraction of a freak show. Wait, what? His wife was beautiful. Why'd they put her in a show like that? The friend solemnly tells him that her arms and legs had been mutilated. In one version of this story, she's taken much like the previous girl, with a fake drop floor. In another iteration, the incident takes place in New York City, the bride taken from the restroom. When asked why this story appeals to the Japanese, Shudo, the student who submitted it, pointed out that Japan is a country who was incredibly isolated from the rest of the world for centuries. Even though their borders have been fairly open to travelers for decades, the fear of foreigners certainly lingers, and not just in urban legends. A Japanese children's song called The Red Shoes, popular before World War II, a line goes, quote, "A girl wearing red shoes was taken away by an ijin-san," which means foreigner. Shudo says that Japanese parents commonly warn children that they'll be sold to a foreign circus if they don't behave, and a lot of them have freak shows. It also shouldn't be ignored that Japan has been in a fair number of brutal wars and conflicts with the nations around it, including Japan forces occupying the Philippines during World War II. Even long after these conflicts, the wall of suspicion and hatred felt between the countries involved will take a long time to settle, if it ever does. That being said, the fact that the bride of the story is found in a Filipino freak show is a revealing detail of the antagonism still felt between the Japanese and the Philippines. Or it could reveal their own guilt. Zooming back out a bit, iterations of the same fable includes a Scandinavian or American traveler being swiped from under the nose of her own tour group while traveling in Turkey. Her clothes show up in a bazaar, a marketplace, in Istanbul. The fate of the woman never discovered. A couple backpacking in the Far East later found dead in their sleeping bags. Their heads had been cut off and switched with each other. One version directly implicated a New Orleans Jewish shop owner specifically. All of this reflects much of the same sentiment. Anyone not like us is dangerous, and if you go to their home turf, don't expect to make it home. But what was that term I mentioned before? White slavery? What exactly is that? The most common reason for these kidnappings is for prostitution, which falls in line with the moral panic titled white slavery. This panic peaked in 1880s Britain and 1910s United States, despite the core of the fear having been challenged and debunked from the very beginning. The base of this story is fairly easy to deduce. Young white women are kidnapped for the purposes of sex trafficking and prostitution, and that the procurers of these women will go to extraordinary, and frankly ridiculous, lengths to capture their quarry. They're also almost never caught, which I think is more for the sake of giving a way for the story to exist at all. Having the villain escape allows them to strike again later, as well as conveniently providing almost no proof of the story's veracity. And if there's a rescuer in this story, they're frequently white and male. And with enough stories, this holds up the Caucasian man as a hero. In one story, a girl at a soda fountain sees a man drop powder into her glass. For some reason that's beyond me, she still drinks the soda. When she gets dizzy, falling semi-conscious, the man takes her by the arm. He assures their worried fellow patrons that this is his sister, and that she often has these fainting attacks. He insists that he'll take her home in a carriage. Though the girl can't protest, an eagle-eyed bystander steps in to rescue her. 1914, Massachusetts. A victim is injected with a narcotic drug as she passes the would-be kidnapper on the street. This was a fairly common claim, but it was debunked almost as soon as it popped up on the streets. Pamela Donovan writes that the underlying current to this moral panic is a reaction to sex work in general. During its spikes, both in Britain in 1880 and in America in 1910, society saw a demand for urban industrial workers in a working class desperate for money. The reality for many women, particularly for lower class or immigrant women, is that sex work wasn't exactly a choice. They had almost no other options. At the same time, and probably as a reaction to this financial desperation, there was public outcry for chastity, monogamy, and purity that was expected from middle and upper class white women. Between this rough and tough scramble for stability in the working class and the poise of the middle and upper class was the allure of the forbidden. By threatening middle and upper class ladies with sexual slavery, it would hopefully scare them away from engaging in taboo physical encounters. Essentially, it was an attempt to control young white women, to force them back into the mold of Victorian ideals that the older generation was desperately clinging to. There was such a concern that a silent film called Traffic in Souls was presented in 1913, played as an instructional film for female immigrants at Ellis Island. Of course, people were horrified at a film about such a subject, and the only reason it was permitted to be shown was its arguable PSA contents. This film would inspire the infamous Hays Code to ban any other films with a laundry list of subjects, and that included white slavery. There are several storylines that the film jumps between, but I'll keep it focused for the sake of the episode. A candy store, owned by the wealthy Mr. Trubus, is shown as the first scene. The scene cuts to a brothel where women are locked in their rooms. Two middle-aged women look on as men push the younger girls back inside. Ignoring the chaos, the women split the money earned at the brothel with the men. A girl tries to quietly sneak past, but is caught and shoved back into her room. Back at the candy store, a brothel man wearing a straw hat scopes out a young woman working at the candy store. He showers her with attention and gifts, taking her out dancing. Eventually, she accepts a drink from him. She's dragged, unconscious, to the brothel. Cutting a lot out for time, the police raid the brothel and rescue the girls. The newspaper running the headline, 50,000 girls disappear yearly into the clutches of the white slavery trade. The twist is that the town patriarchs who'd been leading a campaign to stop white slavery were actually deeply involved in and financially benefiting from the white slavery they claimed to despise. A side plot that we jump back and forth between involves two Swedish girls who are conned by a fake employment agency. Needing work, and with a huge language barrier in the way, it's easy to hustle them into the brothel. Though fortunately, a cop catches on to what's happening and busts in, brandishing his gun to rescue the women. It's an interesting film to watch. Everyone's dressed in suits, nice hats, and elegant styles. It's certainly not what comes to mind when you think kidnapper. But that makes this movie potentially more accurate than most perceptions of abductors. Unlike the xenophobic and classist anxieties carried by the concept of white slavery at large, this film took a fairly realistic stance that you can't just look out for the obvious villain. Unfortunately, people with money have a lot of influence, and some people will use it however they want. I appreciate the intention of the film to be a warning for incoming immigrants who would be encountering language and cultural barriers that less morally upstanding citizens would take advantage of. Even though this movie is over a century old, its story continued to echo through the decades. The fear of women being kidnapped from public places to be used as sex slaves resurfaced in popularity in the 1960s, and it didn't just stay in the US. Particularly in Orleans, France in the summer of 1969, there were claims that young women were being drugged and abducted from dress boutiques. Poor French girls being trafficked to Arab harems started to make their way into popular books. Quote, "Several thousand teenage girls disappear from Paris every year. The police know, but cannot prove that many are destined for Arab harems. An eyewitness reports that auctions have been held in Zanzibar, where European women were sold to Arab customers." By the 1970s, the term white slavery was retired, the terms sex slavery or trafficking replacing it. On December 17, 1998, sex advice columnist Dan Savage printed Savage Love, in which the author claims that, in the 80s, his sister was warned by locals in Europe that rich Arab men would have white women kidnapped off the streets of Western Europe or while traveling in Egypt, forcing them into a harem. Brunvand noted two versions that we haven't already mentioned. The first was what he calls Goldilocks on the Oregon Trail, where a Native American chief tries to barter horses for a young blonde pioneer girl. The second is essentially the same story. This time, an Arab sheik attempts to trade camels for a Scandinavian tourist's daughter. From reading through these sources, as well as consulting a general history of Britain and the United States, I feel like there's also a projection of guilt around what Britain and the US have done to people of color. What if, someday, what goes around comes around? So many people were enslaved and used by Britain and the United States, and what if those people are just waiting in the wings, more than ready to pounce, to enact a ruthless revenge in favor of centuries of brutality? The ingrained belief in the superiority of the Caucasian race may also play a role here, albeit one buried under decades of retellings. Why wouldn't people in strange countries want to seek out the most beautiful, the most youthful women they can find? It's an odd note of self-centered superiority and victimization, that white people are the most worthy of being targeted by ne'er-do-wells. This, of course, ignores the hundreds of thousands of women and girls of color who are trafficked every day. As a side note, I also want to bring attention to the fact that boys and men can be trafficked as well. We just haven't gone into it, and it's not the focus of this urban legend. But make no mistake, the sex trade has destroyed millions of lives, no matter the gender or race. After a century of investigating and debunking these stories in both Europe and the United States, we can conclude this. Sex trafficking is very, very real. However, who traffics victims and how is very different than the urban legend would have us believe. Unfortunately, it's often guardians and parents who contribute to sexual enslavement, usually due to debt bondage or other financial struggles. The Human Rights Watch organization explains that trafficking of Nepali girls to Indian brothels is frequently via offers of marriage or legitimate work. Sometimes law enforcement collusion is also involved, but, quote, there is little evidence that stranger abduction plays a role in it. And somehow, the stories both highlight the mysterious perpetrators while also having an air of derogation towards their target. Which stories have a victim that showed, quote, the least possible complicity with their attacker? The narratives make an effort to sway the listener, directing them towards which victims are worth our pity. Quote, in Jones and Aronson's 1973 study of rape fault attribution, subjects tended to hold a divorcee least responsible and a virgin the most responsible for her victimization. At the end of the day, society wants a perfect victim. This concept is absolutely nothing new, not even today. For the mall abduction urban legend, this is present in the entire story. There's much hand-wringing and anxiety around unpredictable danger when women are seduced, quote, into leisure, consumption, and self-fulfillment. The benefits of disposable income within the middle class becomes a danger, taking a steep price from middle-class families. The crime legend hammers the message into us over and over again, quote, that home, school, and work are zones of safety, whereas public areas in which leisure is emphasized are not. It's just for the best that women not be in places where they can be distracted by material things, tragically taken advantage of when their guards are down. Don't be fooled by that faux concern. It's just another way to keep women in the home. The story is repeated because it feels like something plausible, something that could happen to anyone. This, naturally, scares the listener, and they try to find a way to prevent something similar from happening to themselves or a loved one. While we know the bad guy, we can't really pin them down either. Enter the strategy of blaming the parent. The legend is engineered to have us walk away with the thought, well, if they'd only been paying attention, if they hadn't been looking for a dress for themselves, this wouldn't have happened. I would never be like those parents. I won't ever let my guard down. It sounds exhausting, doesn't it? And yeah, the average person can't really predict where bad people are, when they'll strike, or who they'll hit. But locking ourselves in our houses, or only existing at work or home, isn't much of a life worth living. But I digress. I feel like I briefly need to mention something that kept coming to mind as I researched this episode. I remember the huge hubbub being made about trans women entering women's restrooms around 2015-2016, maybe a little before. The fear of men dressed as women was already quietly sprinkled across these kinds of urban legends, as well as others that I'd like to cover at some point after this season. The fear of who's sharing public spaces, or what could happen in a public bathroom, it just prickled at the edges of my memory. The front-facing concern for women being attacked, but that concern being placed squarely at the feet of trans women. So I did a little research into this concern of the other when it comes to gender and public space, because I'd argue that this might be the next stage of evolution for the mall abduction and mutilation urban legends. Malls have been steadily waning in popularity and affordability for years, so the story needed to adjust if it was going to survive. I found the article, "I Am Afraid of the Bathroom," written by Carl Charles in 2015, right in the middle of the panic. The general concern was that a new law could allow male predators into women's bathrooms. Unfortunately, as Charles points out, many elements have added up to predispose the public to accept the riptide of an undercurrent message that trans people are liars and deviants. There's always been a gaping hole where appropriate or accurate representation should be when it comes to trans people in media. Although The Silence of the Lambs and Psycho are classics, they're sometimes the only frame of reference that a number of people have for what being trans means. This is despite the villains dressing as a woman being a criminally based deception, not a reflection of their actual identity. There's no attempt to actually understand what being transgender means. It's just a gimmick to make the villain seem even more mentally unstable, which then further delegitimizes being transgender. And a film like Ace Ventura? Jesus Christ, forget about it. Whether a man dresses as a woman or not, as a means to gain access to the bathroom, it doesn't really matter. The crime is still the same. The amount of time they'll get is still the same. If the same large man is seen going into and out of the room, the victim can testify to that, or a video camera can record it. So there's no real benefit to dressing as a woman to gain access to the bathroom. When it comes to being caught or not, any person going into a room with one entrance and one exit is going to have a pretty good chance of being caught after a crime, especially in a place like a mall or theme park. There's nothing stopping a man dressed as a man from going inside. Because let's face it, as scary as it is, if a man wants to assault a woman, he will. They clearly aren't concerned for what's against the law when it comes to assaulting women, so why the hell would they give a shit about the law when it comes to entering the bathroom as either gender? Here's a Des Moines Police Department spokesperson to elaborate on that fact. Quote, "I doubt that's gonna encourage the behavior. If the behavior's there, sexual predators are gonna behave as they're gonna behave, no matter what the laws are." Charles writes, quote, "When something as necessary and basic as going to the bathroom becomes the subject of ballot campaigns, school board meetings, and legislative battles, the message that we get is clear. You cannot exist. You are not people." Statistics show that trans people are overwhelmingly far more likely to end up a victim of violence than to perpetrate it. I heard the arguments from people who were close to me at the time. Without fail, their defense that they were just concerned for women, it was all just a cloak for their own prejudice against the LGBTQ+ community. They claimed to back the ban on trans people in bathrooms in order to protect women, but the same people didn't understand why I was scared to walk alone across my downtown school campus to my car at 11 o'clock at night. And I know it's 2025 and not 2016, but unfortunately, many transgender people face a lot of prejudice and violence today. This is as far as we'll go with this conversation in this episode, but I think it's important to mention when talking about where to assign blame when it comes to urban legends. Because, as we've already seen and will continue to see, urban legends influence how we perceive people and life situations. Alright, why are any of these urban legends even still around? As we've discussed, these stories developed even before the early 1900s. The building and popularity of malls sharpened the terror of the public, breathing new life into the kidnapping horror stories. But once the fear of malls died down a bit, why didn't the urban legend eventually die with it? Well, part of its survival is because these stories aren't entirely the victim of chain emails and gossip. As it turns out, there have been a rare few who have utilized malls as their hunting grounds. In 1984, spree killer Christopher Wilder took a 6-week cross-country trip. On this trip, he targeted and abducted young girls from shopping malls. The teens and young women he kidnapped would suffer a combination of sexual assault, stabbings, shootings, and/or electrocution. He relished in their torture and agony, even gluing 19-year-old Linda Grover's eyelids shut. Though this hero of a girl managed to lock herself in the bathroom, with her captor no longer able to prevent her from calling for help, she started screaming bloody murder, and the coward ran. I'm incredibly pleased to report that, against staggering odds, Grover did survive. Wilder's MO easily calls to mind the urban legend of the man who helped a woman change her tire, the security guard and the would-be victim finding his weapons in the trunk. And just like that, all those dismissed second or third-hand stories from worried family and friends warning about the dangers of the mall, all those stories suddenly didn't feel so extreme anymore. Skipping across the wide blue waters to the UK. In 1993, a strange combination of the abduction and mutilation stories took place. 2-year-old James Bulger was led out of the Merseyside shopping centre by 10-year-olds Robert Thompson and John Venables. I won't go into what those two boys did to James. You get the point. Again, a very bizarre and rare incident seemed to validate the fears of the urban legend that had started to settle. 1996. The killer couple, Gerald and Charlene Gallego, kidnapped young women from shopping malls as sex slaves for Gerald. I bring up these 3 cases to demonstrate how incredibly rare real-life tragedies can keep an urban legend alive, sometimes even prompting it to evolve. And to the fearful, it doesn't matter how much of the urban legend is true versus exaggerated. Not when they can open the morning news and see the likes of serial killers and murderous children. Let's go back to telling these fairly vague stories and what folklorists believe about them. Folklorist Richard Dorson believes that the mutilated boy legend reflects, quote, 2 of the most anxiety-laden issues of modern times: racial fears and the decline of downtown businesses. He noticed that the legend would gain new life whenever new suburban shopping centers were opened, and people began to abandon smaller businesses. To many, this also meant abandoning the pinnacle of small-town America, and, by extension, the American dream. Brunvand also points out that most news reporters, when they're tracking down these stories, are mostly interested in whether the story is true or not in where the story came from or why it's reared its head in a specific area. So quick little news articles might settle rumors in the short term, but they don't really help people understand those stories, and there's not much preventing the next round of social media posts reviving it again. Another common folklore theme, a theme certainly not unique to this story, and I encourage you to keep it in mind as we keep covering urban legends, is that there's some kind of conspiracy or cover-up, be it from the city, the mayor, the police, the store itself, or anyone with power, really. It's a way to kind of shrug and claim there's no point in searching for valid sources, because they've all clearly been erased or hidden. This also means that any media that tries to debunk these rumors is immediately dismissed, since obviously they've been paid off by whoever's in charge of the cover-up. And even if the story's entirely made up, better safe than sorry, and best if you can pass it along to warn others. These stories try to claim that they're cautionary tales, while simultaneously demanding to be taken seriously as real news. Whether the police or mall security are to be trusted at all, America still has a kind of belief and pride in vigilantism, boosted by widespread gun ownership and accessibility. The police are a possible option, but how these legends are told places the responsibility squarely on the parent or victim. Quote, "Mall security may close the exits to the mall, but it is the mother's powers of observation, now again hypervigilant, that actually foils the crime in the abduction legend." I also think that all of us have experienced some elements of these stories. You felt uncomfortable in a public place. Perhaps you felt watched. You've lost sight of a kid who was in your care or part of your group. That drop in your stomach when you can't find them near you, amongst the crowd. I'm sure I'm not the only one to have noticed just how many shopping malls are now empty. A large amount of shopping takes place online now, with no concern of a public restroom or fitting room. But I doubt that'll stop this urban legend's general fears. They'll only change forms. The best thing we can do is to try to verify our sources, understand our fears, and stay safe. This episode has been very interesting, particularly for a set of stories that aren't as commonly told these days, and they were never considered the most popular urban legends in general. But now, we go from stories that were usually conveyed through single-sentence warnings to the stories that have possibly been the first urban legends that most children hear. Until next week, don't take the back roads or lovers' lanes.